So the first thing is that I'm going to try to put into practice some more visual and some more like oral performativity in this presentation. And the core of my problematic here is how we validate and how we construct and how we build up knowledge and what different kind of knowledge there exists, and also how to think about an epistemodiversity, if I can call it that way, in order to achieve a biodiversity. So I will be like reading because normally I tend to go out of time. So I really wanted to keep some track on myself. So at the end, probably I will unpack, or maybe through the session of questions and answers, I will unpack more interesting notions, because I already seen that some of the axes that are present in my dissertation here in my lecture have been already like being debated, but hopefully it will open up new lines of research. So I will start. Let's see if this works. Great. Well, the university where I work and where I studied my undergraduate program has an interesting logo, joined by an even more interesting phrase. These two act as a synthesis of the academic and humanist spirit of the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, PUC, from here on. At the main entrance, there is a disc with the image of a ship sailing through an agitated sea, and above all, the star is guiding the way, like an arc, like a celestial vault. A Latin phrase stands in the scene that says, "Il lux in tenebris lucet," which means the light shines in the darkness, obtained from the Gospel according to St. John. Regardless of the University Catholic legacy and its historic tricks to get rid of it, the phrase and image will serve as a starting point for an analysis over knowledge, location, and difference. What is this light that illuminates everything? What is the ray of clarity and lucidity that comes to reveal the core of the surface and that allows navigation even in adverse conditions? The sharpness of the light of knowledge is not a foreign feature to history, actually. It is quite a historical category. We rarely stop to think about this historicized category of creation, legitimation, and diffusion of knowledge. I don't think there is a correct way to start this without locating ourselves. Today, a multiplicity of languages, bodies, and memories come together to listen to each other, but we are all located in a specific territory. The history of the establishment of this light of knowledge in this part of the world is not innocent. Perhaps a perspective from the country presented by from my country, presented by the philosopher Augusto Salazar Bondi, could offer a short tracing of the genealogy of thought in Latin America. Salazar Bondi's question was, is there a Latin American thought? In this question, the violent roots of what we understand as thought and as tradition of knowledge are hidden. I quote, "The process of a Latin American philosophical thought begins with the introduction of the predominant currency in Spain at the time of the conquest. It begins with the framework of the official political and ecclesiastical system of education and with the main purpose of training the subjects of the New World according to the ideas and the values sanctioned by the state and the church." For the Peruvian philosopher, the historical patterns of thinking in our territory began with the Spanish invasion, bringing a flow of currents according to the time and opening a story of parallelism between the West and the Americas. Bringing the Spanish philosopher José Gauss into the discussion, Salazar Bondi concludes that there is no American philosophy as it is understood in the Western tradition. There is something else. But can we really trace the history of thought only from the moment when the Iberian wood mortally kissed the Caribbean sand? Unfortunately, Salazar Bondi's analysis is partially blind with respect of the original knowledge of the territory that accuses of epistemic poverty. This does not mean that there has not been an interesting turn in how to understand the indigenous knowledge of this region. Later, the author will open up an interesting portal. For now, we cannot neutrally think about the arrival of Western knowledges in our territories. I quote again, "In Latin America, the process of the Spanish conquest destroyed all the theoretical resources of the great Amerindian cultures." This is from Enrique Dussel. The little ship crossing the ocean is not so innocent anymore, or is it? Getting a little closer to the southern nations of the continent, this same Argentinian author, Dussel, has promoted a long line of research on what we mean when we talk about knowledge in Latin America. Dussel begins with where Salazar-Bondi seems to end, when the latter speaks of the impoverished and illiterate masses framed within the spiritual framework of remote and sclerotic traditions and beliefs. Here, Dussel bets that the production of myths was the first rational type of interpretation or explanation of the real environment. That means the world, the subjectivity, the practical ethical horizon, or ultimately the reality itself. If we want to talk about the history of knowledge before the kiss, or before that kiss between the wood and the sand, we must understand that perhaps it took place in a very different way from how it is understood in Europe at the end of the 15th century. For Dussel, the constituent elements of philosophical thinking are found in different forms in the original nations of the region. I quote again, "This is how mythical traditions are born, giving people an explanation with reasons for the most arduous questions that plagued humanity and that we have called problematic cores." I end the quote. This bet opens up a rich horizon, but it is very common for it to be contested. The colonial approaches to knowledge are often accused of lacking their own history. But what history are we talking about anyways? Salazar-Bondi's brief historical review is a good example on how Latin American Creole elites have westernized their universities and their archives, leaving local knowledges to oblivion and to epistemicide, a concept of de Sousa Santos. There is no Andean, Ashaninka, Aymara, or Guarani historicized past as understood in the West. Nonetheless, there is a convulsed present of mixture and potentiality. The former accusation about lacking history only reinforces the Eurocentrism entrenched in the academic core. This is because this knowledge, often in narrative and cosmological codes, does not meet the requirements of modern knowledge. These are pre-modern, biased by its subjectivity and instability, too local, too political. What a mess. On June 5th, in 2009, there was a violent eviction of hundreds or thousands of Amazonian community members who had been occupying the place called La Curva del Diablo in Bagua, Amazonas, in Peru. Since April of the same year, as a protest against the violation of their historical or native rights, the eviction ordered by the central government of Peru produced a battle between police and community members that resulted in dozens of deaths and the loss of the prestige of the state authorities. It was the beginning of the end of an ethnic and cultural confrontation between two worlds or cultural groups that have been going on for months, years, and centuries. The well-known case of Bagua conflict and massacre in Peru is the most recent example of a friction of knowledge sparkling off a modern state interest and the pre-modern territory. The conflict originates from a series of private investments in the aforementioned territory as a consequence of the then recent free trade agreement with the US. The government of President Alan Garcia Torres publicly announces that those, the indigenous people, are opposed to our modernity, to sustain the violence deployed in that area. The Peruvian state, with a view to its insertion in the international scene under the North American wing, then unpacks an administration of the territory that is based on the colonial republican legacy of luminous knowledge. Everything is in sight, everything is mapped, everything available, everything must be outside of the shadows of obsolete obscurantism. The clear clash of what Salazar-Bondi called remote and sclerotic beliefs with Garcia politics in 2009 fits the initial question of whether there is Latin American thought. I personally think that this question really meant whether there is any luminous Western thought in these savage lands. The Baguazo articulated violence within knowledge, knowledge that knows to subdue, which subdues to modernize, and that modernizes to exploit. Dussel allows us to better understand the elements woven into this intended modernization. I quote, "We have repeatedly said that modernity simultaneously supposes 1. Capitalism, 2, Eurocentrism, and 3, colonialism, as a constant cause of the original accumulation of mercantile money. It is no coincidence that the baguazo happened as an insurgency to the global capitalistic market. This is just one more tentacle of what the Peruvian Aníbal Quijano and Immanuel Wallerstein classified as the world system. Modernity, capitalism, and colonialism were three heads of the same being that emerged after the kiss between the ships and the sand back in the late 15th century. In that sense, America is the first modern creation in history. As a European project, the continent receives a new set of knowledge that display power to configure beings. The luminous knowledge that maps to better navigate invents the Americas and at the same time excludes the pre-Columbian world. For centuries, epistemology has built its own cathedral of legitimation, its own systems to make its historical condition invisible and to hide its own relocations. In 2011, the Catholic University of Louvain brutally fired researcher Barbara van Dijk for having participated in an action to decontaminate a field of genetically modified potatoes. The dismissal had a notable media coverage and academic repercussions, giving visibility to the demands of the so-called slow science. The philosopher of science, Isabel Stengers, takes this case to start a debate on these previously mentioned relocations. I quote, "Researchers are educated in a way that privileged at the same time the master reference to individual merit and the strongest distrust of everything that could resemble a politicization of science." The dismissal was a political act in the scientific academy, where supposedly there is light and facts, but there are no subjectivity and dirty politics. I quote from Stengers, "The fact that the university authorities have covered a promotional action with the noble name of science allows us to glimpse a new aspect of the knowledge economy, of the prescribed association between public research and industry. It is not only the researchers, the equipment, the public money that can interest an industrial association, but also the stamp scientific legitimacy. The university offers a new service to its associates, the protected places that it will defend in the name of science." I end the quote. Depoliticized and alien to the mundane passions of the subjective and the local, the discourse of this light illuminating darkness rises as immaterial and stark reason. However, as Stengers points out, disciplinary cases like this assume that there is a rupture of neutrality when a professor embarks on activism related to her field of research. How do you process this case of violation against the apolitical, apparently with a trial, which is a political social organ itself? But who is really the entity that makes the demand? Is it the luminous university that, offended by the transgression, suspends the professor? Or is it the transgenic company that was blessed with the neutral studies of the academy to continue with its operations on the legal edge of Belgian standards? In reality, both could end up being one large entity. Stengers invite us to think more deeply about the relationship between the independent and neutral light and the industrial and economic forces that feed back into its bases. The author proposes that Liebig's chemistry, considered a pioneer of organic chemistry, is the first branch of science that ended up setting its own dependence on the industry it fed, thus creating a first fast science. I quote, "The modern academic chemist no longer has anything to say to artisans because he does not have the means of understanding them. Therefore, it is symbolically dependent on the industry that develops its own procedures to mass produce what it has learned to isolate and to identify or synthesize." I end the quote. This relationship is restless and disturbing. Two paths open for the researchers then: submit to industrial secrecy, or to stop being a colleague of the light, or to stay enlightened by contributing to public knowledge, but without touching the obscene ground of political responsibility. I quote from Stengers again, "The official story is that the academic hen lays her eggs and is happy to learn that some of them have turned into golden from the point of view of industrial development. She hopes that all of humanity will take advantage of it, but she doesn't hold herself responsible if it doesn't. Not only it is not her thing, but that should not be, because it would be to commit a mix between facts and values. Therefore, the hen is limited to hoping that those to whom she entrusts her eggs will act in the general interest, but her own task is to remind again and again that human progress requires the advancement of knowledge, to which she has a duty to devote herself entirely. It is precisely this that Stengers refers to as fast science. By the way, when he invented fast science, separating it from the arts and the craft of chemistry, Liebig also cut it off from the concerns to which those arts and crafts responded, from the ground where they were rooted. In other words, the concern of location and politics in their practical frameworks. An ethereal light illuminates like a star in the firmament, as such, untouchable, inviolable. It does not inhabit any place. It has no position. The distance between the scientific and the political comes from the fact that the scientist does not understand him or herself as a social agent, but rather as something superior to the passions of the polis. Do we want to give a body to this light? This means, can we embody knowledge? Well, let's get our hands very dirty. It's not going to be nice, and I don't intend to do a complete review of the subject either. I don't have the time. But if I started the topic with a ship crossing the sea, which is a very colonial figure, using the colonial thought and a light as a dissipator of academic darkness, then I can take that unruly sea as a starting figure, a body of water, a body, after all, what happens to it? Is the researcher's body too comfortable to point out? I want to refer to a fragment of the book Simians, Cybers, and Women from 1995, which was written during the scientific wars, where the pseudo-objectivism of the scientific legacy and its refusal to understand the power dynamics that created were problematized. The disembodied light needs to land and sink in a specific place. In order to become a body, Donna Haraway, a well-known biologist and philosopher, proposes in this text of the chapter called, a chapter called Situated Knowledges, and opens up an important problem around the researcher's body and the legacy of gender in the history of this luminous knowledge. I quote, "In this view, science is always rhetoric, that is, the persuasion by important social actors that one manufactured knowledge is a pathway to a desired form of objective power." I end the quote. Without that distance granted by the much desired objectivity, the science, God forbid, would also be inserted in the mundane ocean that supposedly seeks to illuminate. A slow science, or a decolonial turn in science, will not be possible without sinking in the darkness of the tumultuous ocean. All scientific truth is the result of a historical specificity, but does this not mean that it has to be an invalidation? Scientific truth will always be a partial truth, and aware of its historical contingency. To historicize luminous knowledge is to turn the lights of enlightenments a little bit off, in the sense that it will stop being a navigation monopoly and will diversify its sources. If light has been an important metaphor in this presentation, it is because the visual, the eye, has been the epistemic driving force in the West for centuries. Light excites the eye, but this is an eye that claims to be stark, neutral, without locality, without politics, without a body. I open quote, "I would like to insist on the embodied nature of sight to proclaim that the sensory systems that have been used to signify a marked leap out of the body towards a conquering gaze from nowhere. This is the gaze that mythically inscribes all marked bodies, that fabricates the unmarked category, that claims the power to see and not to be seen, to represent and to avoid representation. This gaze signifies the unmarked position of man and white, one of the many obscene tones of the world of objectivity." I end the quote. I apologize if this seemed very obvious from the start. I don't think it comes as a surprise what is mentioned through Haraway, but this floating encyclopedic eye, if we force it to land and to locate itself, will show up as an appendage of the Vitruvian man. To balance the power of the eye that sees everything and is everywhere, but at the same time does not see itself and it is not located in any specific place, it requires to locate knowledge. In other words, it needs knowledge that is understood as part of the stormy sea. This is not falling into postmodern relativism so fashionable in social media either. Perhaps a faithful form of objectivity is to know how to account for the conditions of production of said knowledge. When falling into the dirt and dark waters, the light is just one more body. It inhabits the mundanity that it investigates. It is traversed by the problems and it becomes always partial. It fragments into 1,000 flashes, sunk into the currents in a possible new home far from immaterial celestial vault. It ends up meeting other navigation agents who were unsuspected and who are now in dialogue, something like us in this moment. I open quote, thus, I think my problem and our problem is how to simultaneously achieve a version of radical historical contingency for all knowledge claims and now unknowing subjects. To create a critical practice capable of recognizing our own semiotic technologies for making meaning and a meaningful engagement that achieves trustworthy versions of a real world that can be partially shared and that is supportive of global projects of finite freedom, adequate material abundance, modest meaning in suffering, and limited happiness. The ship sunk. The firmament collapsed. All lights come from within the tumult. We need a universal circuit of connections, including the partial ability to translate knowledge between very different and differentiated communities through power. We need the power of modern critical theories of how meanings and bodies are created, not to deny meanings and bodies, but to live in meanings and bodies that have a chance in the future. This also applies to the possibilities from the local body as a politically conscious natural science. I open quote, scientists are beginning to understand something that we have known for some time in the humanities and the arts. We get entangled with the data that we analyze. The philosopher Timothy Morton thinks about the submerged light as a form of consciousness, and not just any consciousness, an ecological consciousness. It is with this last point that I seek to intersect the interest of this meeting. Ecological awareness forces us to think and feel on multiple scales, scales that cause the confusion of normative concepts such as present, life, human, thing, thought, and logic. Morton calls this kind of awareness ecognosis. Therefore, here united, we are passing from luminous knowledge to another figure, maybe something more like a bioluminescent fish in the dark currents, which navigates its surroundings with a fractal light broken into several parts like a prism and contaminated by other lights. Darkness shines in the light. In part, ecognosis supposes to realize that the human being are instilled in very deep levels of the humanness, not only biologically and socially, but also in the very structure of thought and logic. Coexistence with these human beings is knowledge, art, ethics, and economic policies. Our bioluminescent fish of knowledge is dirty, is complex, incarnated, partial, and thanks to this, it is ecological. It interrelates with its environment and other bodies. It exudes its light as a result of multicolored bacterial collaborations. This light navigates, but does not see everything. Perhaps this is the way to unlock the paralysis of thinking without that single almighty light. Bodies and texts wants to communicate the same thing, the impossibility of relaunching the political outside of a new centrality of the erotic, the sensual, and the sensitive. This is a quote from Stulwerk. To embody and to situate the light of knowledge is to make it precisely that, to incarnate within the sensual and the sensitive. Morton advocates for a dark ecology, one that shatters the light of enlightenment a little bit in order to enchant us with the locality that cannot see everything, and that, multiple as it is, needs different agents to partially complement its own gaps. I quote, "Ecology, after all, is the thought of being at different scales, none of which has priority over others." I end the quote. My dear colleagues will navigate this concern from the human and from the non-human ecological in diverse and creative ways. But this category needed to complex the previous base of thought a little bit more. Here is where I try to position this lecture. I advocate for an ecology of thoughts. It is necessary to highlight this as a political committed step to transparent the methods of production and power in knowledge, and epistemodiversity will then allow a biodiversity. Lux in tenebris lucet in lux. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diego. And now we are going to open the floor for questions and comments. Yeah.
Gracias, Diego. You mentioned Isabel Stengers more than once, so I wonder if you might want to say a bit about how you came to her work and why it matters to you and what the point you were trying to make now.
Yeah, sure. I met Isabel, well, it's not that I met her like having a coffee with herself or something like that, but I crossed her work with the cosmopolitical, the idea of the cosmopolitical, this idea of actually trying to create knowledge not by consensus, but maybe over dissensus. This idea of different knowledges and different backgrounds coming together and not trying to find just a solution in a very practical way, like this kind of like one-sided linear idea, but a complete and a problem itself, and also having her way at her side, like trying to inhabit this problem and trying to find herself in this muddy situation, and to understand that maybe there are some things that have no literal or one-sided solution. This kind of like the questions themselves are very important, open up speculation and opens up new lines of future and different actually I really liked the approach of Stengers to how knowledge could be understood in diversity, because this is a very important problem here, that is we all are trying to talk about the diversity and the importance of diversity in knowledge, but how to try to convey all these knowledges in difference. I mean, like, yes, we can talk about locating knowledges and everything, but if every one of us has a deep and own version of what the truth is, how are we meant to understand a more collective single notion of truth? And this is what I wanted to open up a little bit, and I'm sorry that I'm using your question as an excuse, but but this is the question of solidarity in epistemology and in general in knowledge, and how to understand solidarity between difference. And this is a very important question, I think, and I would like to just take a more gender and sexual studies framework, like maybe from the notion of sinosolidarity from Diane Bauer and Helen Hester, for example, that I find very useful to try to navigate this. I mean, like, I've been trying to sink a little bit this little ship and to sink also the light, but what about this muddy water? What about this turbulent ocean? And this kind of idea of sinosolidarity itself needs the process, and this is very satanic for me to say, but I really like the idea. This needs some kind of alienation. And this is very like provocative, because obviously this is one of the most complex notions of these authors from feminist background. But I really think that it's needed to understand what are we talking about when we say alienation. It's not this Marxist concept of alienation of the worker that is alienated because of the machines or whatever. No, it's not reification. It's alienation in another way. And this idea of being solidarity itself needs alienation. I mean, like, to break the ego a little bit and to understand other by speculation, because I cannot understand what is to be the other person. This is there is this very nice text that is what is like to be a bat or something like that. And there is a huge like gap that cannot be solved. And the only way to solve this gap is through fiction and speculation. And here's where I want to really put the point, because I started with the idea of decolonizing epistemology and the importance of mythical and fictionalized knowledges. And I mean, like, Dussel does a great work with his own emancipatory theology and everything. But I would like to think really like emancipatory fiction or like a cosmovision that is rooted into local and South American traditions, like at least from my ground, a little bit more like from the Andes zone, which is very rich in this kind of tradition. But yeah, I just wanted to point out the idea of how to have solidarity between difference. And this is an open question, of course, but I really do think that we can learn a lot, for example, from queer theory for answering this question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for a really thought-provoking talk. And I'd like the idea that you ended on of an ecology of thought. I was hoping you could open that up a little bit. And I'm thinking about the semantic field of that a bit. And so how would you distinguish, if at all, between an ecology of thought and an ecology of consciousness, or an ecology of awareness, or an ecology of imagination? Assuming that it seems to be sort of moving towards the idea of solidarity. So I'm a little curious where you might draw lines, if at all.
That's a very good question, actually. I don't think that I have the answer like in 100%. For me, it's very important that to understand epistemology, we have to understand an ecological relation. I mean, like, we cannot build knowledge without interrelationship, without different bodies having friction with themselves and trying to like understand this gap of like Jakob Uexküll, I would say, like the different umwelts from these ways of life. But I think that maybe where I would put the line is like, there must be some navigational items. I would say that epistemology should be like, at least from my point of view, more a methodology than an end of itself. Like how we navigate, how we try to establish relationships between other bodies, human or non-human. Epistemology starts there with some sort of solution, like trying to offer a partial light to navigate this ocean. It's not that is why I don't want to understand the production of knowledge in a very encyclopedic way. Like, we have to know it all, we have to understand it all, we have to illuminate everything, because this is terribly violent. And plus, if you talk to any research in the like very basic sciences like mathematics or physics or chemistry, they all know that all knowledges are like porous, like it's like a Swiss cheese, like, and that's the reason. The theory itself fits from a model, and a model is just this kind of maquette from the world, and it's meant to be like with holes in it, because with the time there will be another model that will try to put its own production into those holes, but at the same time it has in its own holes. You mean, you know, this is like a very ecological chain process, and that's where I want to like put the importance of, we need to keep on going with this kind of like mission of knowledge, but I think it's the methodological approach which has to be like a little bit more fixed, in the sense that it has to be diversified, yes, but we have to understand it as an ecological model. Like, if we want to talk a lot about biodiversity, we have to talk also about the diversity of knowledge. And well, for another moment, maybe we can talk also about technodiversity, which is super interesting. But yeah, I don't know if I actually answered your question.
We'll listen to Laura and to Pablo together, and then you can respond. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Hugo. That was great. I guess just to say, I really like this notion of this idea of epistemic poverty, right, in the South. I think it's something really important to play with. But I guess this is really important, and what you mentioned here, that even within kind of sort of the hard sciences, there is almost a humility that's embedded that we were talking about even with your talk, David, of we don't know everything. We keep on building on what's gone before. And I'm just wondering, when it comes back to governance, decision making, and this is because I find myself sitting in these intergovernmental panels, IPCC, IPES, where governments are like, give us the evidence so that we can make decisions about things, right? And, the more you say it's complex, it's messy, it's connected, it's diverse, like holding pluralism is really difficult as a response in that instance. And just wondering where some of these potential incision points are, where we can actually start moving away from this idea. And even within sustainability, this idea that we can manage the planet, that there is these SDGs, this endpoint, this singular notion of where it is we want to go. And as soon as you say it's plural and messy and complex and diverse, I mean, I was just sitting trying to sort of write the paper on futures where they were like, but like diversity is bad, is different. We know, where it is we want to go, and we know what's wrong and we know what's right. And yeah, just how there is a way to not just within academia have these open conversations, but to start to infiltrate in this, if you want to call it the science policy interface, for want of a better word, some of these notions so that we can hold plurality better in our decision making.
Voy a hacer mi pregunta en castellano. Bueno, tú comentaste la obra de varios autores decoloniales y recientemente se han hecho dos críticas bien interesantes al pensamiento decolonial. Me gustaría saber tu posición frente al tema. El primero es a partir del trabajo de Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, que en una entrevista ha dicho una frase que ha removido bastante el debate, donde dice que lo decolonial es una moda, lo poscolonial es un deseo y lo anticolonial es un deber, para referirse precisamente o poder desmarcarse un poco de cómo hoy día lo decolonial también se está transformando en una moda académica que permite publicar en espacios donde antiguamente los latinoamericanos no teníamos oportunidad, y cómo un pensamiento epistémico realmente anticolonial tiene que estar en compromiso con las luchas sociales, ¿no? Esa es la primera pregunta. Y lo segundo, que es la principal fractura del pensamiento decolonial, es cómo la fractura o la fisura que se generó a partir de la posición que los decoloniales también han asumido en relación al Estado. Entonces, también preguntarte ahí, ¿qué piensas a partir de lo que tú nos estás diciendo en relación al Estado? ¿De dónde vienen esas otras construcciones epistémicas? ¿Es una transformación en las estructuras a ese nivel, o se construyen desde la autonomía, desde lo local, en esas posiciones? Eso.
Okay, that's quite like voluminous, but I will try to put together something like for instance, from the third, I think the first answer will link to the second, maybe, hopefully, if I try to make it right. But first, I think that what to do with governance. I mean, like, if there is a plurality of epistemologies and from different bodies and everything is vibrating and everything, how can we take decisions that are actually, of course, will feed from the local, but actually will have repercussions in the macro, And for me, this is like also a methodological problem, because we have to acknowledge that maybe the way which we have been applying governance in a collective way has been lacking. I mean, like, that's why I just very briefly quoted Diego's toolwork, because I think that we need a turn in epistemology and also in governance in which when I talk about the aesthetic, it's not I'm talking about nice taste and good design. I'm talking about the sensual and this sensing aspect of it, and how to embody this kind of like political need and a political urgency. I mean, like how to understand governance from an aesthetic point of view is, and obviously we would say like propaganda and everything. Of course, the visual have been overused, especially in the 20th century, but how to understand aesthetics beyond propaganda and beyond just the visual and oculocentric aspect. And I would say that this is not like maybe the happiest answer for this, but I would try to put my bet into the potentialities and the possibilities of actually rethinking ethics from aesthetics. I would even put it like epistemo-ethics or epistemo-aesthetics also, like how we can grab knowledge and grab political possibilities from aesthetic practices. And this is obviously, again, not only visual, but also like, for example, time-based aesthetics, like the rituality or the performativity or the interrelationships that constitute the identity, for example, of much more local little collectives. Of course, how to make this micro politics that works in a very specific local spaces into the macro. That's quite a messy question, and I don't think that I'm ready to get into there. But I would say, just like as hope and a very effective point of view, that yeah, I would make a bet for aesthetics. And for the other side, like, yeah, I really like and I really know the production of Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. I don't know if I should, no, maybe I keep it in English, but and I really like her concept of chic. This like, there's again this idea of the multiple and the difference that is coming together to find a neutral point. And this is a very good, actually, this is a very good criticism to the colonial thought, especially because, as you said, it has become like this kind of very easy access for making sexy texts and sexy PDFs to get into a nice, I don't know, magazine or something like that. But how to stay out of the rhetoric aspect of decoloniality and to put it into methodologies. That's why I'm constantly talking about methodologies, because how to put this into practice. And obviously it's going to be messy because some, I mean, like this puts into crisis all these ways of doing that we have been legitimating for decades. And that's why also I started with Salazar Bondi, because he had this very nice and very like generous genealogy of how philosophical thought came into America, and how it, at the end of the day, his conclusion is that we mirrored everything from Europe, just we didn't contextualize all this. So the thought of Rivera Cusicanqui, for me, it's very interesting, not only because she's trying to put some nuances or grace into this kind of the colonial aspect of the colonial turn, but also because she's like really asking for the gender and the sexual aspect of this decolonial turn. And this is where I find her work very like important. And this is like something that I would have liked to put out there a little bit more in the presentation, because like the gender and the sexual level of these discussions have not been very like present in these days, and that's more like where I come from. And I really think that, for example, when she's criticizing Mignolo because he's like in the greater universities of the global south and the global north and everything, I find that it also comes with a criticism of solidifying identities in a category that actually replicates the hegemonic notion. I mean, like when yesterday, I don't remember exactly who, I think it was Jorge, when he was talking about indigenous people, like as a category that actually could open up something else, like some sort of performativity, and not only as a racial category from the Western tradition. What does this mean? I mean, like in my country, I mean, like supposedly I'm the second most indigenous country in this continent, and how Peru has been navigating the concept of the racial has been very problematic. And we have arrived from 1950s to this kind of conclusion that solves everybody, like, okay, we are not white, we're not indigenous, we're all of us, we have something in between. Like this is like the no tienes de indio, tienes de mandingo, this kind of idea that is very popular in Peru. And even now with this kind of the industrialization and the tourist industry in Peru with the food, I mean, like good Lord, I mean, like I'm Peruvian, I really like the food, but sometimes it's like, come on. And it has become this kind of brand that fits itself from this fantasies and fetishes that comes with the indigenous category itself as a fixed and solid category that cannot keep up with obviously the syncretism and the changes. I mean, like this is also from Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, when she's like she puts this example, marvelous example, where there is like this little school somewhere in rural Bolivia, and there is these two kids talking in Quechua, and they are like, okay, tomorrow there will be someone from the government that will come, so we have to put the costumes of the Indians. And because we need, the teacher said that we will have to put a show for the, I mean, like indigeneity itself maybe also is some colonial category. And what, I mean, like, and that means, what about the body? If indigeneity is some kind of performance for the Western and colonial eye or gaze, what about the body? And this is a question that maybe the Chicxi concept would grab in a better way, and also maybe would link towards this kind of xenosolidarity, or the alienation idea, in which, I mean, like, you talk with somebody, at least I'm talking always from the Peruvian context, like, to identify oneself as indigenous is very, very difficult. Obviously, there is a lot of whitewashing and everything, but the category itself, it's like, it says nothing at the same time. It's so like, it's like a strategy, it's a political strategy. And sometimes we perform indigeneity, we want something, we perform other things, we want other things. How do we navigate this turbulent ocean? I mean, this is an open question, and obviously it's posing a lot of like very interesting subjects out there, but I'm out of time. We'll talk later.
Thank you so much, Diego. Thank you. Thank you.